Our first speaker is Parag Khanna. Parag has come all the way from Singapore to be with us today. He is a leading global strategist and best-selling author. He will speak about how beneath the chaos of a world that appears to be falling apart is a new foundation of connectivity pulling it together. Parag?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm delighted to be with you today. We don't often take the time to stop and think about how our world is organized. And that, in keeping with the theme this morning, is what I want to do with all of you. I want us to reimagine how life is organized on Earth. And I want to think about how all of you in this room, your industries, your companies, are participants and drivers of that change. We're so accustomed to thinking about a world in which where we are located or the country that we live in, our geography, dictates our destiny. But in fact, something incredibly profound is happening. We're moving towards a world in which it is connectivity that is our true destiny. And I want to show you some maps of how that is actually happening every single day. This is what I call the global connectivity revolution. And it's something that's begun over the last couple of 100 years and is accelerating at an incredibly fast pace today. This is a map that shows you all of the world's transportation, energy, and communication systems. In other words, all of the highways and railways, all of the pipelines and electricity grids, all of the internet cables, and so forth. They connect all of us. They connect all of our continents together, and they are like the equivalent of an exoskeleton that we have bolted on to the planetary body. They are how we are building something that is greater than the sum of our parts, something that stretches beyond each of our individual nations and communities. And strangely, this is not the map that hangs in many classrooms in the world today, but it should, because the total length of all the connectivity in the world is hundreds of times greater than all of the political borders put together. But we don't map it. We don't appreciate the extent to which we are transitioning into this global network civilization as a result of the connectivity revolution. So the maps that we use to explain the world to ourselves are very often either the maps of natural geography, blue for the oceans, green for the forests, brown for the deserts, or political geography. The maps in the middle, that's the kind that all of you have hanging in your offices. They're the ones that our children have in their classrooms. They show us how we are divided from each other. But the maps that matter most in the 21st century are the maps that show us how we are connected to each other, how we use our space, how we build this global society. And those are called functional maps. And those are the ones that I want to emphasize because those are the ones that are missing from our lexicon. They're even missing from our political culture. And yet they are going to continue to define us more than political maps have in the past. And why is that? It's because this global connectivity revolution is driven by infrastructure spending. Now, if I were to not put up this slide and ask many of you, what is it that governments spend the most on? You might say the military and defense. But actually, all of the world's militaries put together, all of the defense budgets combined, total about $2 trillion per year. That may be a lot, it may be too much, but it's actually much less than what all of the governments, all of us, all of our societies and communities spend collectively on infrastructure, on those bricks and mortar basics that allow us to live in modern societies. But actually many people don't. Even though we are spending about $5 trillion per year collectively on infrastructure, that's insufficient. We now live in a world of about 8 billion people. And I believe we should spend about $1 trillion on the basic needs of every billion people in the world every single year. So we're falling short. And in many countries, including right here in the United States, we don't build enough adequately to enable and empower people. And that's what connectivity is all about. Building the infrastructure, building the linkages that allow people and communities to connect to each other, to be more autonomous, to be more self-sufficient, to be more vibrant and productive. But if we stick to the course that many people do predict, especially in a world of low interest rates, we could imagine actually catching up to that need, to spending the $8 trillion or more per year that we need to in order to help people around the world meet their basic needs. The reason this becomes even more essential is because we are urbanizing so rapidly. Now, one of the other flaws that so many of the conventional maps that we use has is that they don't show people. We show maps of nature, we show maps of political boundaries. What about people? What about us? Where are we in all of those maps? So this map helps to correct for that first and foremost, because here you can actually see where all the people in the world are. The entire distribution of the world population is here, with yellow being the most dense areas and purple and black being the most sparsely populated places. So you can see, of course, that we are an urban civilization with most of the world's population in Asia. And you can see that, that these ovals that are drawn in, they show you that cities are not just little black dots. Right? On political maps, Dallas-Fort Worth, for example, might be the same size as any other city in the world, just the same size black dot. But that's not what that's not the shape that urbanization is taking today. Instead, we live in a world where cities are becoming vast archipelagos, stretching tens or even hundreds of miles or kilometers. And therefore, we need to map them very differently. So instead of little dots, we should actually show them as these ovals. And there are about 50 or so of these megacity clusters or regions that really define not only the population centers of the world, but also the economic centers of the world. So the larger circles on the outside actually help you to see how cities are not only demographic sort of engines, if you will, but they're also the growth drivers for entire national economies, especially in emerging markets, especially in the developing world. You'll find that 50% or more of an entire national economy will be centered on just one city. So if you take a place like Indonesia, most of the economy is what goes on in Jakarta. But Jakarta has only about 25 million people, which is obviously quite a lot looking at it from the perspective of an American city. But that's only 1/10 of its entire national population. What about everyone else? So even though we have this inexorable trend towards urbanization, people are flocking into cities, that doesn't mean that they're all equally well connected. Right? So part of what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that it's fine that the core principal city, the capital city or the commercial or financial center, is a driver of a national economy. That's great, but what about everyone else? And so this is also a warning. This is a call to action, that we need to invest more in the connectivity of all of the people who, in the case of Indonesia, don't live in Jakarta. What about all the second tier? What about all the third tier cities? What about all the rural populations? And the same applies in India. The same applies across Africa. The same applies in the Philippines or in Latin America. Around the world, we need to emphasize this connectivity because it is also one of the key things that is going to help us to overcome inequality. To build more connectivity that empowers people, not just in the capital cities and financial centers. Next slide, please. There we go. Around the world, this clustering of populations into cities is a very, very significant trend. Even China, a civilization that has more than 5,000 years of continuous history, that has many different organic, linguistic, and provincial and cultural divides. China has 34 provinces. And yet today, and we think of China as a vertically integrated, top-down kind of system. But beneath all of that, and aside from all of that, they are also reorganizing themselves administratively, functionally, into about 24 megacity clusters. Why are they doing that? Well, they want each one to be more self-sufficient. They want each one to be more viable economically. We know that more dense urban environments will focus more on the services economy and therefore be more resilient to when there are trade shocks and financial crises. And so despite the fact that China is a very vertically organized political system, they're actually devolving authority in some ways towards these cities, empowering them, enabling them to develop their own strategies, their own master plans, their own industries, attract investment, build their own airline connections abroad, their own trade relationships with other cities and countries. But what China has also done is to invest in the infrastructure, as I'm sure you know. Not only is each of these circles a cluster of cities that has good quality infrastructure internally, but they're all linked to each other through what has become the world's most extensive high-speed rail network. So becoming not just an empire the way we think of it as, but an empire of megacities that are well connected to each other. That's how countries go from becoming disparate and sparse and decentralized the way India is, towards becoming a superpower, which is what China effectively has become. That is the power of connectivity. And speaking of China exercising or flexing its muscles as a superpower, connectivity is how that is done as well. China has more neighbors than any country in the world. It has 14 neighbors. It doesn't want to fight a war with them. The way in which it extends its influence is through the power of connectivity. And what you see on this map are the plans for the railways, the pipelines, the electricity grids, the hydrological canals, all of the engineering and construction projects that are going to allow it to build across the Eurasian landmass from east to west, reaching Europe. Now, the majority of the world's population lives on this image. You don't need a round globe to understand the future of most of humanity. You can actually see most of the world's population right here. Even a small subset, actually, of this map. Just a circle around, if you put Hong Kong in the center and drew a circle around it covering India and Southeast Asia, you'd have more than 50% of the entire world's population. And for the rest of your lives, for the rest of all of our lives in this room, that is going to be true. Most of the world population will be right here. And the things that China does in terms of investing in connectivity, investing in infrastructure, are going to reshape geopolitics, they're going to reshape the world economy, and that process is well underway. It actually began about 25 years ago. Here we are in October of 2016. Does everyone remember where they were in the fall of 1991, 25 years ago? Do you remember where you were when you saw the images of Boris Yeltsin standing on a tank in Moscow in December of 1991? Was the collapse of the Soviet Union. That happened 25 years ago. And when that happened, China found itself bordering more former Soviet republics in Central Asia than even Russia itself did. And because China had been building westward, suddenly it was able to access even these new markets. And that's what it continues to do today with institutions like the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the AIIB, which you've probably been hearing a lot about over the last couple of years. And that is just one of the institutions that is going to be making the investments and sponsoring these new Silk Roads. China talks about the One Belt, One Road, reaching from Shanghai all the way to Lisbon. Because indeed, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Europe has been building out infrastructure going eastward, modernizing the countries of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, incorporating them into the European Union. And so as Europe builds from west to east and China builds from east to west, they meet in the middle, and the world's largest landmass of Eurasia will become, again, in the next 10, 15, 20 years, it's happening every single day, an ever more integrated supercontinent, if you will. And I find this very interesting as someone who studied geography, because so often in school we're taught, and you can confess if this happened to you, your geography teacher taught you that Europe and Asia are different continents alongside North America, South America, Australia, and so forth. But they're not different continents. They're different cultures, but they are one geological feature. And only now in the 21st century is the power of connectivity unifying this into what is easily the world's largest economic zone. And that's going to be one of the great stories of the 21st century, the power of connectivity in the world's largest landmass. What about our continent? What about North America? Well, let's start just with our own country. Let's start with what's happening in the United States. We still define, our politics are still very defined by the map of the 50 states. And of course, that's very significant if your name is Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. You're out there trying to win votes and get elected. But the rest of the time, what matters more in terms of using connectivity, using infrastructure to build a more cohesive society, a more productive economy, are actually not the state lines and borders that separate Americans from each other, but rather the infrastructures that can connect us and make the national economy more efficient. So this map shows you in colors the natural economic geographies of the United States. The agriculturally productive areas, the commodities-rich areas, our manufacturing and industrial centers, and the white shaded areas show you the most urbanized zones. So you can see the Texas Triangle, for example, or the Northeast Corridor stretching from Boston all the way to Washington. And then the black lines are the proposed corridors for high-speed rail networks, for example. When President Obama was elected, he promised 8 high-speed rail networks. Those were meant to be shovel-ready projects after the financial crisis that would create lots of jobs and help to make the national economy more efficient, enable more mobility, for example. Of course, here we are at the tail end of the Obama administration, and there's 0 kilometers of rail that have been built. Now, one can agree or disagree about whether or not America needs such an extensive European-style or Chinese-style high-speed rail network. But we can't disagree, or we have to accept the fact that the United States economy is suboptimally efficient. There's a lot of inefficiencies in our transportation networks, in our commerce. And yet, if you look back over the last couple of 100 years, the things that have made America a great continental empire, a superpower, infrastructurally, and as a society, have been things like the Louisiana Purchase, the Erie Canal, the Pacific Railroads, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the interstate highway system. Thinking big, thinking continentally is what's made this a United States of America. And today, there's not a single project, not a single infrastructure project on the American agenda that lives up to the potential to further unite the country, to harness our energy better, to make it a more efficient and productive society. And I think that's unfortunate. The map of the future of America doesn't need to be just the 18th century map, the early 19th century map, crafted by the founding fathers, in particular Thomas Jefferson. It should also be a united city-states of America, in my view. And that logic applies to this whole continent. We need to think beyond, and I know this is incredibly contentious today in the presidential election, but think beyond not only just our own boundaries and even just our current trade arrangements with our 2 neighbors, Canada and Mexico, and instead think about this North American Union. It's an idea that's been proposed for a long time, and I do believe that eventually, no matter what happens in our politics, we optimize in this direction, we move in this direction. Because, in fact, not only are Canada and Mexico 2 of our largest trading partners, we are certainly the largest trading partner of our neighbors, but we share a lot of resources as well. There's a lot of connectivity if you look at the railways, the pipelines, the electricity grids, and now ever more foreign investment that is flowing across our boundaries. And yes, there's positives and negatives around the ways in which trade dynamics play out, whether it's with your neighbors or with trade partners around the world. But we are not adequately, or at least many people in the political scene, are not adequately calculating the incredible benefits that come from having peaceful relations with 2 very significant countries like Canada and Mexico, and thinking about how important they are as markets, not only as a source of labor that sometimes competes with some Americans, but as a market and a destination for our own goods as well. So I think that over time, we will gradually evolve in this direction of realizing that we will be stronger as an integrated North American continent than as just 1 out of 3 countries in this geography. And as I've shown you before, that's actually how people in the world's largest landmass of Eurasia are thinking. People who have much less in common than we do with our neighbors. So we can do better. We can evolve our psychology towards this functional relationship with our neighbors. Now, connectivity is also about the movements of people. The more connections we have across boundaries, the more people are enabled to move. It's something that, of course, we're seeing on our television screens every day. But let me put it in a bit of context again, in this long arc towards the notion that geography is destiny and you're rooted where you were born, which is still true of most of the world's population. However, if you look at the way things have been going over the past decades, there are more migrants than ever in human history. There are more people living outside their country of origin. There are expatriates who work in professional sectors. There are guest workers and laborers who are moving around the developing world. And of course, there's refugees, political refugees, or even ecological refugees. All of that taken together constitutes a global migrant horde, if you will, that is reaching about 300 million people, far more than ever in history. It's a relatively steady percentage of the total world population, but we live in a world that is way more populated than it was after World War II. So it is a lot of people, and that obviously transforms identity, it transforms politics, it reshapes our societies, and it is because of connectivity. It is because the supply of labor and people and their talents and capabilities and the demand for it around the world needs to be corrected. And so even though there is a backlash against migration in many places, to some extent here, far more in Europe, bear in mind that in much of the world, borders have actually been coming down. Yes, in Europe right now, they're repealing some of the free migration agreements that they have had over recent decades. But at the same exact time, just a couple of months ago, all African leaders got together and declared their goal of having a continental free trade area and a single passport for mobility. That's more than 1 billion people. In Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, as they're known, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have gotten together and passed not only a free trade area, but an economic community in which there's free labor mobility. That's 700 million people. So yes, there are political problems in Europe, and it may be more difficult for X number of million people to cross boundaries. But at the exact same time, what you may not be paying attention to is that more than 2 billion people have agreed that there's going to be a lot more mobility, a lot more movement, because they've realized that in the long run, welcoming talent, welcoming people, welcoming diversity, embracing diversity is the source of growth and of progress. And indeed, history demonstrates this. If you look at the great cities of the ancient world, whether it's ancient Athens, whether it's Amsterdam, whether it's contemporary cities like London or New York or Toronto or Singapore or Dubai, what all of the great cities, the global magnets, if you will, of the past, present, and future, all have in common is that they are melting pots. Is that, again, they welcome talent, they welcome diversity, they welcome creative flows of people from all over the world. They have very high foreign-born percentages of their population. So whatever is happening today in the local politics, whether it's in Europe or here, bear in mind in the long run, the pattern is very, very clear. The great global cities are melting pots. Now, of course, connectivity is not just physical infrastructure for transportation, it's not just the energy networks that we've mapped out, and it's not only the flows of people, it's also in the 21st century going to be about the flows of data. And the original map showed you the world's internet cables, for example, of which there are about 300 or more that have been laid on the ocean's floors, and all the time, every year, several new or many new internet cables are being laid down. Across the Atlantic, Pacific, even eventually over the Arctic Ocean to connect countries together, because the value of that connectivity, the value of the flows of data is becoming an ever greater share of the total world economy. The value of the world trade in services is catching up to the value of trade in goods, bits becoming as valuable as atoms, and that's accelerating at a rapid pace. So the most societies are seeking to be as digitally connected as well. So this is not a map of the internet cables like the one before, this is a map of the density of data connections. Not only the access and the speed of bandwidth that people have in different parts of the world, but how fast they can connect to each other, because that is going to be a very important part of the future of trade. Again, not only exporting manufactured goods or exporting commodities and oil, but also exporting our knowledge and exporting things over these internet connections. And that is happening faster and faster all the time. And that requires investment not only from governments, but increasingly from the private sector. In generations past, it's always been governments that have driven infrastructure spending. But today, when it comes to digital connectivity, we're seeing the telecommunications firms and the internet companies making some of the most significant investments and setting themselves up to be the global utilities for this all-important digital economy. So my final point is about what this all adds up to. What happens when we transform the world map or build new layers on top of our natural geography, on top of our political geography, and build out this world of total functional connectivity? It winds up being, and this is the good news, a more progressive world, a more resilient world. Why is it more resilient? Well, there are a number of ways. When you think about geopolitical history, what we're most concerned with is choke points, blockages. If there is a cutoff in the flow of oil or of goods in one of these three red dots, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Hormuz, or the Straits of Malacca, for many people that means that there's going to be war, right? And in fact, if we were gathered here 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and we were to pose the question, where is World War III going to break out? A lot of people would say the United States and China are probably going to fight World War III in the Middle East, over energy, over oil, over minerals in Africa, or something like that. Well, newsflash. As of April this year, instead of fighting with China over energy, the United States directly exports oil to China. That's only as of this year, for the first time, because Congress in December 2015 lifted the long-standing embargo on the export of American hydrocarbon energy. And every year, this year, next year, and onward into the future, China will buy more and more American energy. So why would we fight over something when we can build and marketize and have connectivity between the supply of energy and the demand for energy across the Pacific Ocean? And now apply that same principle to all of the other resources that we want to shift around the world. And by building the connectivity, such as transportation networks and pipelines and so forth, that is what we are enabled to do. So a cutoff or a choke point in one of these three areas doesn't mean that necessarily there's going to be conflict, because we can move resources over the Arctic, we can move them across the Eurasian landmass. There are many ways in which we connect to each other. And I mentioned internet cables before. If you have just one internet cable, that can be cut off by a ship anchor or a terrorist attack. But what countries are doing is building more and more and more internet cables so that any cutoff in one connection can be substituted by others. And the more connections you have, the more resilient a world you live in. And that fundamentally is what we achieve when we invest in connectivity. A world that becomes, again, greater than the sum of its parts, a world in which more people have the connections, have the capacity to participate in global supply chains and in the global market. So it's not a world that replaces nations and boundaries. The connected world is one that is built on top of that. And in doing so, it empowers all of us. It makes us all better off. So an investment in connectivity is an investment in resilience, an investment in a better future. And I hope that all of you will continue to make those investments towards a better world. Thank you so much.